If you wanted to actually scare a company as big as Microsoft, a competitor wouldn't do it. Another giant tech company launching a rival operating system, another cloud provider undercutting Azure on price, another AI assistant competing with Copilot. None of that is genuinely frightening to a company Microsoft's size because that's just ordinary competition, the kind of threat every large company has a playbook for. What would actually keep a company like that up at night is something much quieter, proof, sitting right there in the open, that the thing your entire business is built on top of was never actually necessary in the first place. Think about the difference between those two kinds of threats for a second, because it's the entire premise of this video. A rival with a competing product forces a response you can plan for. You study the competitor, you counter their strengths, you wait for them to make a mistake, and eventually the fight resolves one way or another. A quiet, sustained proof of concept doesn't offer any of that structure. There's no single opponent to study, no single campaign to counter, no clear moment where the threat either wins or loses. It just keeps existing year after year, adding one more data point to a case that never needed to be argued loudly to be true. That's a fundamentally different and fundamentally harder kind of problem to solve. And it's exactly what's been quietly happening for the past 20 years. That's exactly what a $2,000 laptop from a small company in Colorado has been quietly building for the past 20 years. And this year, it just got a lot harder to ignore. Let's talk about why a $2,000 price tag matters here, because it's the detail that makes this story genuinely unsettling, rather than just another niche hardware review. If System 76 were selling cheap bargain bin laptops at $400 or $500, marketed explicitly as the budget option for people who can't afford real hardware, that wouldn't threaten anything. Cheap alternatives exist in every industry, and incumbents rarely lose sleep over them, because cheap alternatives implicitly concede that the premium product is still better. You're just choosing to go without it to save money. A $2,000 laptop is a completely different kind of statement. It says, this isn't a compromise. This is a premium top-tier machine, priced at premium top-tier rates that customers are choosing on its own merits, with zero Windows anywhere in the box. That's not a budget alternative quietly existing in the margins. That's a direct, full-price challenge to the idea that Windows is a required ingredient for building something genuinely excellent. And let's get into exactly what System 76 just shipped, because the specs are the whole argument here. This year, System 76, their Lemur Pro laptop line with Intel's brand new Core Ultra Series 3 Panther Lake processors. The same cutting-edge chip generation flagship Windows laptops are racing to ship in 2026. The new Lemur Pro comes in both 14-inch and 16-inch configurations, weighs under 3 pounds, and delivers what System 76 calls the longest battery life of any laptop they've ever built, up to 18 hours on a single charge. It supports up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, up to 4 terabytes of storage, Thunderbolt 4, and Wi-Fi 7. Starting price is $1,999, climbing to just under $2,300 for the flagship configuration. On pure spec sheet terms, this is a premium, top-tier, ultra-portable, fully competitive with anything Windows-based, shipping in the same price range this year, and there's not a trace of Windows anywhere in it. It's not an isolated release either, which matters for how seriously to take this. In that same stretch of 2026, System 76 also refreshed their Adder Pro line with a genuinely striking 2K OLED display and a magnesium aluminum chassis, and updated their Serval WS workstation with Intel's Core Ultra Series 2 processors for people doing serious professional compute work. A company doesn't put that kind of sustained, coordinated investment across an entire product lineup unless it's confident there's real ongoing demand to justify it. This isn't a single lucky product. It's a company methodically proving the same point, release after release, year after year. Here's the part that should actually be terrifying. If you're thinking about this from Microsoft's position, and it has nothing to do with the hardware specs at all, System 76 didn't just install a free operating system on top of decent components and call it a day. They built their own desktop environment from scratch, called Cosmic, designed specifically for their own machines and increasingly available across the broader Linux ecosystem. That's not a small side project. Building a desktop environment means designing and maintaining the window manager, the settings panels, the file browser, the notification system, and dozens of other pieces of software. Most people never think about individually, but depend on every single time they touch a computer. System 76 went further still, rewriting core parts of that experience in Rust, a modern, security-focused programming language, specifically to make it fast, stable, and genuinely polished. A company doesn't make that kind of long-term software investment unless it is fully committed to being in this business for decades, not just riding out a temporary trend. That's the signal that should worry an incumbent far more than any single product launch. This isn't a company testing the waters. It's a company that decided years ago exactly where its future was, and has been building toward it with total conviction ever since. Let's talk about why this specific kind of threat is so much harder for a company like Microsoft to actually respond to than ordinary competition. If a rival company launched a directly competing operating system tomorrow, backed by billions in marketing spend, Microsoft would know exactly what to do. It's fought that exact battle before, repeatedly, and generally won. There's a well-worn playbook: undercut on price, bundle competing features, lean on existing market relationships, wait out the newcomer's runway. None of that playbook works against what System 76 is actually doing, because System 76 isn't trying to take over the operating system market at all. It's not launching an aggressive marketing campaign. It's not trying to convert Windows' entire user base. It's just quietly, patiently existing, shipping excellent hardware at full premium price to a smaller but genuinely loyal customer base for 2 decades straight without ever needing to win a head-to-head fight against Microsoft to prove its point. You can't outcompete a company that isn't trying to compete with you directly. You can only watch it keep existing as proof that your own foundational assumption was optional all along. It helps to understand exactly why Microsoft's usual competitive playbook exists in the first place, because it makes clear why that playbook simply doesn't apply to a threat shaped like System 76. In the late 1990s, the US government pursued a major antitrust case against Microsoft, centered on allegations that the company had used its dominant market position to squeeze out competing software, most famously by bundling Internet Explorer directly into Windows in a way that made it genuinely difficult for rival browsers to gain a foothold regardless of their actual quality. The case resulted in real legal consequences and years of ongoing oversight of Microsoft's business practices. That history is exactly why Microsoft's playbook against direct competitors has historically been so aggressive and so effective, undercutting rivals, leveraging market position, bundling features until competing products struggle to gain traction. It's a playbook built for fighting other companies, trying to take market share directly. None of those tools work against a company that isn't trying to take market share directly in the first place. You can't bundle a competing feature against a company that isn't selling a feature. You're competing with a philosophy. You can't undercut on price against a company whose entire value proposition depends on charging a premium price and delivering on it. You can't leverage market position against a company that has no interest in winning market position away from you. System 76 doesn't fit into any of the categories Microsoft's competitive playbook was built to handle, which means the exact tools that made Microsoft so effective at neutralizing direct competitors for decades are simply irrelevant here. That mismatch between a well-honed competitive playbook and a threat that doesn't play by those rules at all is a genuine part of why this specific situation is harder to respond to than it might look on the surface. To be fair, and it's worth being fair here, because overstating this would be exactly the kind of empty hype this channel tries to avoid. System 76 alone is not going to bankrupt Microsoft, and Windows isn't disappearing from the desktop market anytime soon. Windows still runs the overwhelming majority of computers worldwide, and one premium laptop refresh, however impressive, doesn't change that fact. System 76 operates in a genuine niche: developers, system administrators, open source professionals, people who specifically want a machine built around Linux rather than one that merely tolerates it. That audience, while growing, remains a small fraction of the total market. Treating this as an existential threat to Microsoft's core business would be dishonest. But here's why niche doesn't mean harmless in this particular case, and it's the whole reason this story deserves the word terrifying rather than just interesting. A niche threat that stays contained is easy to ignore. A niche threat that keeps demonstrating clearly and repeatedly that a core industry assumption is false is a completely different animal. Because ideas spread even when market share doesn't. Every developer who buys a System 76 laptop for their personal setup is a developer who might eventually recommend Linux at their workplace. Every IT administrator who reads about Cosmic's technical polish is an IT administrator slightly more willing to consider a broader Linux rollout the next time a licensing renewal comes up. The actual commercial threat from System 76's sales figures alone might be genuinely small. The threat from what those sales figures represent, sustained, credible, premium-priced proof that the emperor has no clothes, spreads through channels a company can't easily control or counter with a marketing budget. This lands at a particularly inconvenient moment for Microsoft, because it's happening at the exact same time several other pressures are converging from completely different directions. Millions of Windows 10 users were forced to directly confront the question of whether they actually need Windows, following last October's end of support deadline that locked working perfectly functional computers out of receiving security updates simply because they didn't meet Windows 11's hardware requirements. Governments in Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland have been actively building their public sector computing infrastructure around Linux instead of Microsoft's ecosystem, citing cost savings and a desire for technological independence. From any single vendor, none of these pressures were coordinated with each other. They're each independent stories with their own specific causes, but they're all converging on the exact same underlying question at the exact same time, and a $2,000 laptop from Colorado just added one more piece of hard physical evidence to the pile. It's worth being specific about what those government migrations actually involve, because they lend this whole story real institutional weight rather than just enthusiast anecdotes. Germany has spent recent years migrating tens of thousands of official government workstations away from Microsoft software and toward Linux and LibreOffice, with the explicit goal of reducing dependency on any single foreign technology vendor. Denmark has run a parallel initiative across its own public sector. Switzerland went further still, passing legislation requiring publicly funded software development to default to open source licensing, alongside investment in a sovereign national cloud infrastructure built independently of the big American tech platforms. These aren't small pilot programs run by a handful of enthusiastic civil servants experimenting on the side. They're large, budget-backed, multi-year commitments made by entire governments. The kind of institutional validation that makes System 76's 20-year track record look less like an outlier and more like an early data point in a much larger trend. It's also worth situating System 76 within the broader Linux hardware landscape this year, because the fact that they're no longer quite as alone as they used to be is itself part of what should worry an incumbent watching this pattern develop. Dell has continued selling its XPS line with Ubuntu pre-installed as an official configuration option, not a hobbyist workaround. Lenovo has expanded official Linux certification and support across parts of its ThinkPad lineup, a brand historically associated almost entirely with corporate Windows deployments. Framework, the increasingly popular modular and repairable laptop maker, ships Linux as a fully supported first-class option across its product range. None of these companies are abandoning Windows as their primary business. But watching mainstream manufacturers gradually normalize what System 76 spent 2 decades proving in relative obscurity is exactly the kind of slow-motion validation that turns a niche curiosity into a durable industry shift. There's a specific business model reason this particular threat should worry Microsoft more than it might have a decade ago, and it connects directly to trends we've covered elsewhere on this channel. Microsoft's business has shifted heavily toward recurring subscription revenue over the past several years. Microsoft 365, cloud services, Copilot subscriptions, all built around the idea of an ongoing monthly relationship rather than a single one-time purchase. That business model depends enormously on customers staying inside Microsoft's ecosystem long enough to keep paying month after month, year after year. A one-time hardware purchase that comes with zero ongoing dependency on Microsoft services, no Microsoft account required, no OneDrive nudges, no Copilot subscription upsells, nothing recurring at all, is close to the exact opposite of what the business model needs to keep growing. Every System 76 customer represents not just a lost Windows license, but a customer who will never generate a single dollar of the recurring subscription revenue Microsoft's future increasingly depends on. That's a fundamentally different and arguably more serious kind of loss than losing a one-time software sale used to represent back when Windows itself was the main product being sold. That shift also explains why some of the other stories we've tracked on this channel connect back to this one. We've covered how Microsoft quietly retired WordPad, a free 28-year-old tool with its own documentation pointing users toward a paid Word subscription instead of any comparable free alternative. We've covered how Teams support quietly degraded for Linux users on Firefox, and how Copilot's sidebar shipped broken on Edge for Linux due to one missing configuration file nobody apparently checked before release. Individually, those look like isolated product decisions or oversights. Viewed alongside System 76's steady 20-year existence, they start to look like exactly what you'd expect from a company whose entire future revenue strategy depends on keeping users inside a subscription ecosystem, quietly nudging away from anything, including its own free legacy tools, that lets people opt out of that ecosystem entirely. A $2,000 laptop that requires absolutely nothing recurring from Microsoft ever sits at the far opposite end of that entire strategic direction. Let's talk about pricing psychology for a moment, because it's genuinely the core of why this specific $2,000 figure matters more than it might seem at first glance. For decades, one of the strongest arguments used to dismiss Linux hardware was the assumption that nobody would ever pay real money for it, that Linux only survived as a bargain option for people cutting corners, and that any serious buyer with real money to spend would obviously choose Windows instead. System 76's pricing directly contradicts that assumption. Their customers are paying full premium price, specifically because they want the hardware quality and the Linux native software experienced together, not because they're settling for something lesser to save a few $100s. That's an entirely different business model than Linux as the budget option. And it's exactly the model that proves genuine, sustained customer demand exists for premium computing entirely outside Microsoft's ecosystem. Demand strong enough to fund 2 decades of continuous product development, including building an entire custom desktop environment from scratch. It's also worth noting who's actually buying these machines, because the customer base itself reinforces exactly why this should be unsettling from Microsoft's perspective. System 76's audience skews heavily toward developers, system administrators, data scientists, and other technically sophisticated professionals, precisely the kind of buyers with the strongest incentive to be price sensitive about wasted licensing costs, and the most technical knowledge to genuinely evaluate whether an alternative to Windows can hold up under serious daily use. These aren't casual buyers experimenting with Linux because a video convinced them to try something new. They're professionals whose actual livelihood depends on their machine working reliably, running demanding software, and not getting in their way. The fact that this specific, discerning, technically sophisticated audience keeps coming back to System 76 year after year, paying full premium price the entire time, is about as strong a signal of genuine, durable product market fit as a company in this space could possibly demonstrate. And it's exactly the audience whose opinions carry outsized influence over the IT decisions made at the companies they work for. There's one more piece of this worth addressing directly, because it was historically the single strongest pillar propping up the assumption that Windows was simply unavoidable: gaming. For most of the last 2 decades, you need Windows carried an unspoken but very real asterisk. You need Windows, especially if you ever want to play modern video games, because gaming on Linux was genuinely, legitimately impractical for the average person. That asterisk has quietly disappeared. Valve's Proton compatibility layer, combined with the runaway success of the Steam Deck, has made Linux gaming a real, mainstream, viable option, rather than a compromise reserved for a handful of dedicated enthusiasts willing to fight with configuration files. Steam's own hardware survey has repeatedly shown Linux gaming share climbing well past levels that would have sounded implausible just 5 years ago. Once that pillar weakens, the rest of the case for needing Windows loses a huge amount of its remaining support, especially among exactly the younger, more technically curious audience System 76 tends to attract. It's worth remembering how genuinely difficult building a company like System 76 used to be, because it's part of why this specific 20-year track record should carry real weight rather than being written off as a lucky niche success. For most of Linux's history on the desktop, one of the single biggest practical obstacles wasn't the operating system's software at all. It was hardware compatibility, Wi-Fi cards without working drivers, trackpads that registered clicks incorrectly, graphics chips that ran without proper acceleration or wouldn't wake up correctly from sleep. For a long stretch of computing history, dismissing Linux as impractical for anyone unwilling to spend a weekend troubleshooting drivers was a genuinely fair criticism, not corporate propaganda. System 76's entire founding premise was to solve that specific problem head-on, build and sell hardware where every component is chosen and configured specifically to work flawlessly with Linux, rather than hoping generic Windows-oriented hardware happens to cooperate. That deliberate, sustained engineering effort, carried out over 2 full decades with essentially no major stumbles, is exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous consistency that turns a risky bet into an undeniable proof of concept. There's also a generational dimension worth naming directly here, because it's part of why this specific kind of threat doesn't have an obvious expiration date. People who grew up with Windows as the unquestioned default absorbed an entire mental model of computing built around that assumption. Certain keyboard shortcuts, certain file structures, certain expectations about how software gets installed and updated, all quietly shaped by decades of Windows being the only real option most people ever encountered. Younger users entering the workforce today have a meaningfully different relationship with that assumption. Many of them grew up using Chromebooks in school, which run a Linux-based operating system without ever using that name prominently, and increasingly do serious computing work through browser-based tools and cloud services that genuinely don't care what operating system is running underneath them. For a growing share of new computer users, you need Windows was never something they personally experienced as inevitable in the first place. It's simply one option among several they've encountered, with no automatic authority attached to it, just because it used to be repeated so often. A company whose entire business model quietly depends on that authority not being questioned has every reason to find that generational shift unsettling. So let's tie this back to why quietly terrifying is actually the right phrase, rather than just a dramatic headline. It's not that Microsoft is in any near-term financial danger because of a laptop company most people have never heard of. It's that the entire foundation Microsoft's business has rested on for 50 years, the assumption that computing simply requires Windows, depends on that assumption never being seriously, credibly, publicly tested. System 66 is exactly that test, running continuously in public for 20 straight years at full premium price, with a growing and increasingly influential customer base. Every year that test keeps passing without Microsoft having any real way to make it stop is another year that quiet foundational fear has time to compound. A company can respond to a competitor with a better product, or a price cut. It has no comparable playbook for a slow, patient demonstration that its own core assumption was optional all along, and that's precisely the kind of threat that doesn't show up in a quarterly earnings call, but keeps compounding quietly in the background regardless. It's worth spelling out exactly what compounding quietly looks like in practice, because it's easy to underestimate how these small, individually unremarkable moments actually add up over time. It's a college computer science student who gets their first System 76 laptop as a gift and spends 4 years of their education never once needing Windows for anything, entering the professional workforce with zero attachment to an assumption their older colleagues never questioned. It's an IT director who reads a case study about a mid-sized company that switched its entire developer team to Linux workstations and saved meaningfully on licensing costs, and quietly starts a pilot program of their own. It's a small business owner who hears from a friend that Linux just works now and decides to try it on an old laptop that Windows 11 refused to support, only to discover there was nothing to be afraid of in the first place. None of these moments individually threatens Microsoft's business in any measurable way. All of them together, repeated across millions of small decisions over years, are exactly how a 50-year-old assumption stops being an assumption at all. If you've ever looked at Linux hardware and assumed you'd have to settle for weaker specs or worse build quality compared to a mainstream Windows machine, System 76's 2026 lineup is worth an honest look. The Lemur Pro alone stacks up against flagship ultra-portables costing the same or more, and it's not the only serious option out there anymore either. And if you want to see the full picture of why so many people are questioning the "you need Windows" assumption in the first place this year, I've got the full breakdown of the Windows 10 migration wave linked right here, along with the other stories we've covered about Microsoft's own products quietly underserving Linux users at every turn. The Teams lockout, the secure boot certificate mess, Copilot's broken sidebar on Edge for Linux. Taken together, they paint a much clearer picture of exactly why a $2,000 laptop from a small company in Colorado should be keeping people at Microsoft up at night. Subscribe if you want to keep watching exactly how much of that old assumption keeps getting tested and keeps not holding up. Because if the last 20 years are any indication, the next quiet piece of evidence is probably already shipping somewhere right now, waiting for enough people to notice.